Now, for today's event, for anyone who thought June 23 was coming up sometime, well, flashing caption, it is next week, Brexit or Bremain. And as time gets moving forward, I think it's becoming a bit of a nail-biting decision for the UK. Bookmakers, as we were speaking about over lunch, are about to make a lot of money on this. The opinion polls at this point are starting to show that Britain might actually vote to exit. So, what's going to happen? Well, we're very lucky today to have Andrew Seaton here. He's the Executive Director of the British Chamber of Commerce. You might recognize him from his previous role as Consul General to Hong Kong, and he was with the Foreign Office for 30 years, a lot of that based in the Asia region. However, he has spent 3 years back in the UK and comes back with a fresh perspective. So, as always, we'll have comments and plenty of time for Q&A. Andrew Seaton.
Tara, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be at the FCC. I've sat in this room and been here for a number of other speakers, so it's nice, if a bit testing, now to be on this side of the line. It's very, very good to be with you all. I started talking to friends and contacts and business people in Hong Kong and in China about Brexit, around the start of this year. And then the reaction was very much, well, what are you talking about? Is this really, what is this Brexit referendum thing? And to the extent they did think about it, the idea of Britain actually leaving the EU after more than 40 years in it was somehow unthinkable. Well, as Tara says, Brexit is now absolutely top of the news items. If you saw the news in the paper this morning about the effects on currency markets and stock markets, certainly if you look at the latest opinion polls, and I'll come back to that later, Brexit is very, very thinkable, certainly not unthinkable. What I'll do is I'll briefly cover some of the background. Why is this happening? Why is Britain having a referendum on its membership of the European Union? I'll look at some of the main issues in the debate on both sides, and then offer a few thoughts about what an exit might mean for businesses in this region. A caveat. The British Chamber of Commerce has done a number of events itself on Brexit, but we are neutral as to whether Britain should be in or out. And so I'm speaking from a position of neutrality, and I will try to maintain that position of neutrality. This probably means that I will simultaneously enrage both ardent Exiters and ardent Remainers, but that will be my intention and my hope. So, why is this happening? Why is Britain going through this very, very big and actually rather divisive process at the moment, and one which would have clearly major implications for Britain and major implications for Europe and more widely? Well, the specific reason for Brexit referendum was an election pledge by the British Prime Minister David Cameron in advance of the 2015 election. This was against the background of a long-standing division within the Conservative Party dating right back to the 90s and indeed the 80s about Britain's European identity. David Cameron offered a referendum, an in-out referendum, to try to resolve that issue in the party once and for all, should Britain be in or out, but also, I think, to see off an electoral threat to some Conservative seats from the strongly anti-EU UK Independence Party. So it was a short-term political reason for offering this referendum. But I think also it also reflects a longer-term ambivalence on the part of the UK population towards EU membership. I think in Britain you see none of the sort of more emotional, political attachment to the concept of the European Union, to a European common identity, to a European common aspiration. I think the UK has always seen its relationship with Europe much more contractually, much more transactionally. Is it in Britain's national interest to be in or not? And clearly views on that question are divided. Reflecting that long-term ambivalence, Britain's also had a slightly sort of semi-detached position in some respects from Europe. Britain's been a member since 1972, but, for example, it is not a member of the common European visa zone. So visitors from outside the EU will need separate visas to visit the UK and the rest of Europe. And critically from a business perspective, Britain never went into the common European currency zone, the Eurozone. And I suspect that most Britons are heartily glad of that. But I think that reflects that slightly ambivalent long-term path you've had to this. So, David Cameron offered the referendum, and then, I think slightly unexpectedly, and certainly against the poll predictions, instead of forming a coalition government in 2015, the Conservatives rather unexpectedly won an overall majority. So David Cameron then had to live up to that pledge of allowing the referendum to go ahead. The government then set out to renegotiate key aspects of Britain's relationship with Europe, and some changes were secured. Britain was to be exempt from any further moves towards political union. There was a veto over new EU policy, which had potential negative impacts for British core interests. There are restrictions on welfare payments for new EU migrants, and so on. I think at the end of the day, these tests, these changes really don't actually mount up to an awful lot. But the debate is coming down to, as it always would have done, the fundamental one: should Britain stay in the European Union, or should Britain leave? And it's a serious and passionate debate. I mean, it's a serious and passionate debate here in Hong Kong. I've been at a number of Brexit events over the past months, and we've hosted them. And, you know, it pretty rapidly gets beyond polite questioning. People feel very, very fired up about this. There was a quote in the Wall Street Journal about a month ago, an editorial, which said, "The British are debating the Brexit referendum with a seriousness that we wish the US presidential candidates could match." Now, that may be going a bit far, but, and of course, I guess you could say that, you know, taking as your benchmark the US presidential campaign debate may not be setting the bar enormously high. But anyway, that's a different discussion. But seriously, this is a big and impassioned and serious debate. You know, many of us in this room will have been through general elections and hard-fought general elections. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite as impassioned as this. And it's not really surprising. You know, this is a very, very big, far-reaching decision. British voters are being asked to make, you know, the most important sort of strategic, political, business decision, which won't be a decision for 3 or 4 years until the next election. This is going to be a decision for decades, for generations. So it is very, very important, and I think that contributes to the passion of the debate. I think, secondly, it's highly charged because it, sort of by definition, but because it is so binary. If you think in most democratic systems, in the end, the politics tends to be fought out on the middle ground. You know, there'll be differences in tone, in emphasis, maybe some difference of policy, but they're not fundamental opposites normally. You know, the battle is fought in that center ground. And this is by definition different. It's in or out. There's no halfway. On the 24th of June, Britain isn't going to wake up being a little bit more in Europe or a little bit less in Europe. It's either going to be in or out. So it's a one-shot game with very, very far-reaching outcomes. And that, too, I think, feeds into the emotion in the debate. What are the main arguments? What are the main issues on both sides? First, I'll try to set up what I see as the main arguments being advanced by the exit side, and then the main arguments being advanced by the Remain side. On the exit side, I think there's a big cluster of arguments around Britain resuming its full national sovereignty. Britain being able to organise its own affairs, pass its own laws, arrange its own policies, entirely in ways that suit the UK, which are tailored to UK national interests, without having to go through the process and compromises involved in agreeing those with 27 other member states, without having to cede influence and control over those decisions to the Brussels bureaucracy, who many see as unaccountable and self-serving and so on. The main business arguments, part of it is an extension of that. Business people thinking that the UK would be better if it was able to free itself from what is seen as unnecessary over-regulation from Brussels, that Britain would be able to manage itself better, British businesses able to manage themselves better, and that outside the EU sort of framework, Britain would be much freer to strike out and negotiate bilateral free trade deals with other trading partners, other trading blocs around the world, again, without having to go through the inevitable compromises that are involved in working within the framework of the European Union. Third argument, which is becoming higher and higher in profile, is immigration. For those of you not familiar, countries that are members of the European Union have to accept free movement of people. So any EU citizen is free to study, live, work, reside, retire, anywhere else in the European Union. In recent years, Britain has seen very, very high levels of immigration. Net immigration last year was about 330,000, the second highest level on record. And over half of that immigration is from within the EU. There are currently about 2.1 million EU migrant workers living in Britain. A couple of migrant workers, EU residents, EU citizens living in and working in Britain. About 6% of the workforce, so substantial numbers. And many people are unhappy with this level of migration. They're unhappy with the fact that one has to have, as part of the deal, open borders towards EU migration, that there is no control that can be put on who chooses to come in to live in the UK if they're going from the EU. And they think that the only way of righting that is to withdraw from the EU and to withdraw from that obligation to allow for free movement of people. And then finally, a couple of other arguments that Britain could make much better use itself of the £8 or £9 billion a year that Britain pays into the EU budget. But I think there's a broader context point as well. In the 1970s, when Britain joined the EU, at that point, frankly, sort of the British economy was it was a basket case. The EU was seen as more dynamic, more forward-moving. Britain wanted to be part of that club. And I think now it's a fact that the sort of Europe brand is badly tarnished. There's the Eurozone crisis. We just had this year's annual summer season event of a Greek debt crisis. There's the immigration crisis. And this sense that Europe is now becoming, it's not dynamic, it's not forward-moving, it's a club that we no longer, in Britain, need to belong to. So there's that general context point as well. So those are the main arguments I have seen for exiting. The arguments for remaining, I think the overwhelming argument is economic and business. The importance of British companies being able to maintain unhindered free access to the European Union single market, the biggest single market in the world, over 500 million people. Crucially, a free market both for goods and for services, services being a very important part of the British economy. That exit would carry a major risk to London's position as the de facto capital, financial capital of Europe, and as the de facto capital of the Eurozone, despite not being in the Eurozone. That there will be a switch of that Euro and Eurozone-related business out of London if the UK left the EU. But more widely, there'd be a negative impact on trade and investment flows, including, crucially, foreign investment. And foreign investment has been a very major driver of the UK economy in recent years. And a lot of that foreign investment is in the UK because the UK is seen as a business-friendly operating environment, but in many instances also because companies can operate from the UK right across Europe. And finally, that Britain risks being squeezed out of global trade deals, of regional trade pacts, because it's not arguing with the weight of the EU around it. There have been a number of economic studies, the International Monetary Fund, the OECD, the London School of Economics, forecasting significant drop in GDP if Exit were to happen. Many of the main employer and business organisations in the UK have come out in favour of staying in, including the Confederation of British Industry, which is the biggest employers' federation, and the Trade Union Congress, which is the main trade union body. As a development of that argument, I think that one of the most difficult questions for the Brexit side is thinking about a post-Brexit future. There's no satisfactory model apparently on offer which preserves free access to the European Union single market for British companies, but which doesn't also carry with it continued free movement of people through Europe. So you can't, it looks as if that you can't have those two things together. And finally, I think there are broad strategic and geopolitical arguments put forward by the Remain campaign that the world is a pretty difficult, uncertain place at the moment. Within the European space, you've got a Russia which is behaving more and more assertively, that in tackling these sorts of threats, in tackling other major global threats, whether it's cyber or international terrorism or climate change, that the UK is better doing that in partnership with others than trying to do it alone. Those, as I say, the broad arguments on both sides. If the vote next Thursday is for exit, what happens? Well, in a sense, the honest answer is that no one knows, because this is literally unprecedented. No other country has left the European Union. So there isn't a sort of a game plan to work from. If you look at the European Union Treaty, under Article 50, there can be an up to 2-year process during which negotiations take place, both on the terms of a country's exit from the European Union and on the terms of the future relationship of that country with the EU. So there's a process set out there, but how that would work in practice, it is really very difficult to forecast. And of course, there'd be a lot of other untangling that would have to go on through Britain's membership of the EU, its involvement in other international bodies, international agreements, trade agreements, and so on, which would all have to be untangled. So there would certainly be a process there, but quite how that will play out, we just don't know. What are the implications, briefly, for this region? I think talking to Hong Kong companies, to Chinese companies, as I have been, clearly for those companies who have got operations in the UK or operations in Europe, they are, to put it mildly, following this debate very closely, because the decision could have a material impact on their business in Britain and their business in Europe. So there's a potential real business impact there. I think a broader impact, which is interesting to just think about a bit, is Hong Kong is a free trade town. It has thrived on global free trade, global freer trade. It's the base of a lot of Hong Kong's success. Seems to me, if you look globally at the moment, the sort of global free trade movement is at best stuttering. The WTO process is going nowhere. The sort of the steam behind free trade seems to have very, very largely run out. If you look at the US presidential election campaign, some of what's being said by both of the leading candidates about their views of free trade, indicates a clear sense that this is a more difficult agenda to push. Looked at across the world, the EU is a very, very major trading bloc. Within the EU, Britain has traditionally been the strongest free trade voice within that bloc. And I think it's at least worth speculating about if Britain were to leave, and there are plenty of protectionist pressures around elsewhere in Europe, if Britain were to leave, whether the EU as well, you might see a bit less enthusiasm for that free trade agenda, which, as I said, has got implications for this region. Where are we now? A week away. Tara referred briefly to the polls. And they have really shifted in the past 2 weeks. If I'd been given this talk 2 weeks ago, the majority of polls were forecasting a small majority for Remain, and over the past few days, really, that has shifted quite significantly, so that the two biggest polls over the weekend were showing I think, 5-6 percentage point lead for exit. People have been looking very hard at the bookies. The bookies got called the last general election right when the pollsters didn't. And as Tara said, there's been a huge amount of money being placed on the Brexit referendum outcome. I think it's going to be the biggest political betting event in Europe. And the bookies' odds have also shifted. Again, about 2 weeks ago, the bookies were essentially saying there was about a 20-25% chance of Brexit. And this morning, they were saying there's about a 40-45% chance of Brexit. So it really has shifted significantly. The demographics are quite interesting and quite clearly divided. Broadly, the younger, the better educated, the more affluent you are. If you're in London or Scotland or Northern Ireland, you are more likely to be in favour of Remain. If you are older, less affluent, coming from provincial cities in England and rural areas, you're more likely to be in favour of exit. Age is a critical factor. Over 70% of the over 65-year-olds favour exit. Over 70% of under 25-year-olds favour Remain. But as we all know, the young don't vote, and the old do. I've got a young son at university who I've been badgering to register to vote. And he said, "But Dad, the timing of this is absolutely terrible. It comes after the end of exams. We're all going to be off at Glastonbury and partying, and nobody remembered to post their registration card. It's going to be terrible timing for all students." And so how that plays out is going to be critical. The pollsters think that turnout is going to be a very significant factor. If turnout is high, that probably means that more young people have voted, which is more likely to be Remain. And if turnout is low, then probably they haven't come out in such numbers and more likely to be exit. It seems to me that looking at the debate, I think what's come through very, very strongly on the exit side of the debate in recent weeks has been the immigration factor I spoke about. And I think as we're coming into the last week, if one had to break it down, it's coming down to an argument between the economy and immigration. I think there's a wider factor at play here, which has got broader linkages. If you look at the US, the presidential race, Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, there is this sort of anti-establishment, anti-big business, anti-politician protest vote element that you see there. And I think there's quite a lot of that going on in Britain as well. And that vote, people who just feel that the system hasn't been working for them, that politicians aren't speaking for them, the establishment isn't on their side, that vote will go on the exit side, no doubt about it. The received wisdom is that when it comes to that ballot box moment, that people will vote safety, that actually they'll say it's not worth the risks, we'll stay with the status quo. But politics is a lot about emotion, and it's a lot about momentum, and frankly, it seems to me personally, the exit campaign has got the momentum. So I think there's everything to play for. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If I can just begin by asking, and we'll go around for Q&A, if you say there's everything to play for, and I know you don't want to give your own personal view of what you'd like to happen, what's your gut instinct of which way it's going to go?
Now, really, Tara, I think it's objectively too close to call. If we'd been having this discussion 2 weeks ago, I would have thought probably Remain. As I said, I think that momentum that you're seeing on the exit side has really been significant. There's a lot of criticism of the Remain campaign, that the Remain campaign has been too negative. It's all about the risks, it's nothing about the positive. And that momentum thing, I think, is definitely with exit. So, that seems to be the trend at the moment. But, where we'll be by this time next week, don't know.
Thank you. We have microphones going around the room. Please give us your name and organization if you're with one. We'll start right here.
Hi, I'm Julia Charlton. I'm an English and Hong Kong lawyer. Thank you for a great speech, Mr. Seaton. With your BritCham hat on, assuming Brexit, how is BritCham going to support British business interests and your members in Hong Kong?
What we're thinking about, we've done a lot of work with our members, giving them information about Brexit. We've had a lot of Brexit-related events of various sorts. So we've been trying to make information available to our members. If the vote next week is for exit, as I indicated, I think that there will be a lot of implications to work through, a lot of uncertainty. What we've actually started to be looking at, although we can't really press the button yet because we don't have a result, what we're starting to look at is whether we can likewise be making available information to members, getting in good speakers to actually talk about what the implications, the consequences of this are for British Chamber members and other companies in this region. So that's a plan at the moment, but as I said, for obvious reasons, we can't start pressing the button on that quite yet.
Right over here.
I'm Angus Forsyth. I'm also a solicitor in the UK and in Hong Kong. A couple of years ago, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to the European Union for the very significant achievement of 70 years of peace in Europe, which is a very long time for European internecine conflict, if there is exit. Do you think there's a possibility that that is going to initiate other people exiting, and there may be an issue of disunity arising in Europe as a result?
It's a very good question, and it's interesting you referred to the sort of the sort of the political role that Europe has played in preserving peace. I think it's very interesting if you looked at the period around the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think the role that Europe collectively made then in providing a framework and support for the newly emerging then Eastern and Central European countries to stabilize and emerge and develop was a very important achievement. But that was in the past. And we've got to look to the future. I think it could go, you hear views both ways. Some people say that Britain's exit will spur similar calls for similar referenda in other countries in Europe. There's already in a number of countries in Europe quite a strong anti-EU, anti-establishment movement in France, in Denmark, in Holland. And I think it's reasonable to think that British exit will give that a clear push. I think it's going to be very interesting, which is it's an answer to a slightly different question. Another response may be that Europe will say, right, what we've got to do in response to this is actually get closer together. It could go two ways, but one response might be to say we've got to get closer together. I think what is interesting is that if Britain decides to stay in, I think it's very important that the EU doesn't just sort of heave a big sigh of relief and say, okay, now we can get back to business as usual. I think there's a real, even the most ardent supporters of Britain staying in the EU see lots of problems within the EU machinery and how it works. And I think if there is a vote to stay in, it's important that that shouldn't be taken as just as of a green light for carrying on as we are. The EU, I think, under any circumstances, whether it's exit or remain, needs to have quite a hard look at how it operates, how it connects with the citizens. There's that accountability bit, which clearly is a major issue.
Over here.
Is it correct that when Churchill first mentioned this idea, he had no idea that Britain would be part of it? That's a statement and a question. And the other is, who are the net contributors financially to the European Union?
Your statement, I think that is correct. That was in the 1950s, I think, when they set up the European Coal and Steel Community. Net contributors, Britain is the second biggest net contributor to the EU budget in total, about £8 or £9 billion a week, once you take into account rebate and payments that come out. Contribution per head, where I think the UK is about 6th or 7th. So countries like the Netherlands and Germany are much bigger contributors per head rather than gross.
Right over here.
Andrew, a good talk, but far too diplomatic. We actually really want to know what you think, and you're not going to tell us.
No.
So I'm going to ask.
Come and see me afterwards, Mike, okay?
Okay, I'm about to celebrate my 15th year of not being British, but I am a member of your chamber. Could you walk us through the constitutional aspects as regards to Scotland, to Northern Ireland, and, since I'm on a roll, Wales?
Wow, that's it's not a short answer to that, but I'll try and keep it short. Scotland is probably the most interesting one in some respects. There was, of course, the Scottish independence referendum 2 years ago, which didn't pass, but soon after David Cameron announced an in-out referendum on EU membership, the Scottish National Party said that if Britain were to leave, that they would regard that as sufficient cause for seeking another independence referendum. Opinion in Scotland is very, very strongly pro-EU, and I think the SNP's statement on that reflected that. So there is a distinct possibility of, were Britain to exit, that at X number of years down the line, there would then be a repeat of the Scottish referendum, Scottish independence referendum. Northern Ireland is quite complicated. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, but it's the only part of the United Kingdom which shares a land boundary with another EU state in the shape of the Republic of Ireland. And so there's a physical question there about, if Britain were to leave, one will have to have a border go up on that border, and there's no border at the moment. And that would be in respect of goods, theoretically in respect of goods, people, so forth and so on. And some people in Northern Ireland think that this is very, very damaging, that it's going to be damaging to trade flows, to people flows between the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, are also concerned about, if there's a weakening of the cooperation between Northern Ireland and Britain and the Republic of Ireland within the EU context, that could have negative implications for the peace process in Northern Ireland and so on. But constitutionally, there doesn't seem, there's no appetite for Northern Ireland independence. So constitutionally, if it were exit, Northern Ireland would stay with Britain, leaving the EU, and there would then be, as part of the unentangling I was speaking about earlier, there would have to, I think, be quite a complicated unentangling of Northern Ireland with the Republic of Ireland.
Question on the veranda.
Hi, I'm Nick Gordon. I'm a researcher and writer with a think tank here. We've talked about economic flexibility and business flexibility, but I want to ask about geopolitical flexibility. Britain being part of the EU, but not quite, means that if it wants to get something done in the world, it can either work with the European Union or with the United States, and it can flit between those depending on what policy it wants to pursue. How would that flexibility be impacted in the case of Brexit? How does this affect Britain's ability to, let's say, punch above its weight in the international sphere?
And there are two different answers to that, depending on whether you're an Exeter or a Remainer. The Exeter argument is actually that Britain has got a network of alliances, of relationships around the world, that the UK has got certain strengths, whether those are military strengths, economic weight, so forth and so on. Britain's got considerable soft power through its education, culture, so forth and so on. And that actually Britain will be able to navigate its way through those situations with a great deal more flexibility, seeking alliances, the sort of alliances that made most sense for it on a particular issue, and actually we'd have greater flexibility. The counter-argument, I guess, is that when it comes down to it, a lot of the big world issues, whether it's world trade, whether it's terrorism, whatever it is, weight counts, and that Britain is better exercising that influence through the greater weight that being an influential member of the EU gives. The relationship with the US is interesting. President Obama was in London, about 6 weeks ago, and gave a very, very clear statement that from the US's perspective, from their view of their national interest, they thought it would be better if they would prefer to have Britain operating from within the EU. But I think that sense of there's a natural sort of counterpart there. You can't have it both ways. Either you have the greater flexibility, or you're saying, okay, we may have to give up better flexibility by working within the EU, but in the end we have greater impact. And I think that's the trade-off that you're looking at between those two alternatives.
Another question from the veranda.
Regardless of the outcome of the referendum next week, is the Conservative Party likely to survive as a single party?
I'm really not qualified to talk about sort of UK domestic politics. All I will say is that, frankly, any hope I think that David Cameron had that this referendum would heal that split in the Conservative Party is clearly hasn't worked out. It seems to me the party is very, very deeply split. This has come up in commentary in Britain, and certainly leaders on both sides of the line in the Conservative Party have made been come up very publicly and say, we realise this, we've got to work to mend that split afterwards, whichever way it goes. But clearly the possibility is there, and there's a lot of speculation about what sort of Conservative leader it might take to bring those two sides together. Whichever way the referendum goes.
I can see we're warming up on questions and we're getting close to 2 o'clock. So we'll go over there and try to make sure we get everyone in the room in the next few minutes.
Afternoon, Andrew. Mark Michelson. Want to take you back to Asia Pacific a little bit, especially, I guess, China. Your experience as a diplomat, what's your feeling if Brexit does succeed? What's your feeling about countries like China treating Britain different than before? How important was the EU connection for them, especially from an economic aspect, I guess? At least your impression from dealing with them for so many years.
Yeah. The Chinese government, in the shape of President Xi, actually came out and said that they thought from China's perspective they would prefer Britain to stay within the EU. China has for many decades been a strong supporter of the European Union, seeing that strategically as part of their vision of a more multipolar world. So without doubt, in terms of their policy perspective, they would prefer Britain to stay within the EU. As to how things might pan out were there to be a Brexit, it's quite. One can speculate a lot about this, and as I said, we're in unprecedented territory, so we don't quite know. I think, from my own view, in areas like trade negotiations, I think when dealing with major trading powers like China, I personally accept the argument that weight counts. That I've been involved in international trade negotiations, and they're pretty sort of hard-nosed, tough affairs. And I think that in that perspective, the argument for operating within a bigger economic weight, I think carries some force. But I think it's important to stand back a bit and say, if the vote is for exit, you still end up with a Britain which is the 5th biggest economy in the world, a pretty successful and dynamic economy which has got real strengths of the sort I was talking about earlier. That it's a member of the Permanent Five Security Council, very, very active on various international bodies and organizations in its own right. And so I think it's completely wrong to sort of project some sort of terrible apocalyptic future if Britain were to end up making its way alone.
We'll go right here, and then we'll cross round.
Robin Fox, I'm an associate. Do you think the end game for the EU process is a federal superstate with its own army and diplomatic corps and seat on the Security Council?
Purely personal, I think that may have been the end game. I think that politics across Europe the way we've seen over the past few years, I think makes that increasingly difficult, actually. If you look at the rather different attitudes that some of the Eastern Central European countries take, the split in public opinion in places like Holland, Denmark, I think that sense of a future Europe superstate embodying some sort of common European identity and consciousness, I think that is a much more difficult proposition now, would be my own take.
Right over here.
A quick one on certain legalities. You had mentioned 2 weeks ago that it looked pretty good for the people against it, but conditions and certain issues and bad news around the world have caused it to swing in the other direction. Is it not possible, and I'm referring to referendums like in America being overturned on constitutional basis? California, it happened quite often. So the majority wants it, too bad, it's not constitutional. But this is not a constitutional issue. However, there may be reasons possible that if it passes, it can be blocked in courts long enough for conditions to arise where it might not pass. Just a thought. Any lawyers in the room?
I'm sure lots of lawyers in the room. It's an interesting question. I mean, it's come up specifically, it has actually come up in terms of a scenario whereby if the vote is for Brexit, there will then need to be, as I said, a legal process to disentangle Britain from the European Union. And I think if there are any lawyers in the room, if it is Brexit, I think it might be a field day for lawyers, disentangling all of this. But one of the outcomes of that there'll need to be legislation going through the UK Parliament to approve the terms of the exit and to approve the terms of Britain's future relationship with the EU. And the thought has been raised as to whether Parliament would be obliged to pass that legislation because there had been a vote in favour of Brexit. And there's a debate about that, and some people saying it will be an appalling sort of abrogation of responsibility, that the people's voice must be heard. Other people saying, well, Parliament has got a responsibility for making sure that the deal is the best deal that can be secured. So it's a very interesting question.
We have time for one last question over here. I think you had your...
Uther Charlton-Stevens, Associate Professor at the Institute of Economics and Finance. I wonder if you could expand upon the possible connection between what happened in Greece and the possibility that didn't happen but maybe still could happen of Brexit with the Brexit debate. And if in the future the Eurozone crisis dethaws and re-emerges, perhaps with sovereign debt issues even spreading to a larger economy like Italy, would Britain have been better off in that future scenario in the next 10 years having voted to leave or voted to stay?
Well, it sounds as if you're the economist, not me. Perhaps we should be asking you to answer that question. I think that there's two sides to it. Clearly, Britain has got a strong stake in an economically healthy and dynamic Europe. 50% of Britain's trade goes to Europe. As I mentioned earlier, a huge chunk of Britain's services export, so forth and so on. So there's a real stake there in the European economy. Point one. Point two, of course, the European economy actually is very diverse. You've got some bits of the European economy which actually recovered very strongly from the financial crisis, and other bits which have still not recovered yet and are struggling. And I think what you're seeing in the Eurozone is a monetary sort of arrangement which is struggling to cope with that very divergent economic performance. So, yes, Britain's got a stake in European economic health. On the other hand, because it's not in the Eurozone per se, it doesn't have to get involved in the Eurozone bailouts. Secondly, Britain actually has got, by comparison with some other leading European countries, quite an externally focused economy, strong trading links with other parts of the world, and so probably the impact wouldn't be as strong. But geography, trade links, there'll be able to be some impact.
Well, I'm sure we could debate this issue and discuss it until June 23, but it's just gone past 2 o'clock, so I think we'll leave it there. Andrew Seaton, thank you very much. We have a gift from the FCC. I hope you'll wear the tie and come either drown your sorrows or celebrate at the bar.